floating is being misperceived by the public. This word sensory deprivation is causing people not to recognize that in fact what floating is the perfect backdrop, both from a sensory state and a physiological state, from which to practice meditation. And it creates this amazing bridge where suddenly people who normally would struggle to meditate could access these mindful states almost reflexively, spontaneously, without any effort. We could create a bridge to teach the human population how to access these mindful states. That could be the most important bridge we ever create as a society. This is really the next phase of medicine.
Hello and welcome to the FitMind podcast. Today we're thrilled to have Dr. Justin Feinstein, a clinical neuropsychologist and pioneering researcher in flotation rest. Dr. Feinstein's groundbreaking work in sensory isolation has revealed how floating can transform brain function, reducing anxiety and enhancing interoceptive awareness. His research not only sheds light on the science behind deep relaxation and altered states of consciousness, but also paves the way for innovative mental health treatments in our overstimulated world. Stay tuned as we dive into the fascinating intersection between neuroscience, meditation, and mental wellness. We delve deep into the effects of PTSD and hopefully how we can help those people really in need with his incredible work at the Maui Calm Foundation. I'm an avid floater for myself, but anyone that's even remotely interested in mental fitness will thoroughly enjoy this conversation. Now, let's dive right in. I hope you enjoy this incredible podcast as much as I did. Dr. Justin Feinstein, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. You know, it's been a pretty tumultuous couple of years with the fires.
Yeah.
And the silver lining to all of this is, we actually are going to have the opportunity to launch a really unprecedented initiative to help all the fire survivors.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
I'm excited about that. That's happening actually. We're going to be launching that this summer in Lahaina.
Oh, that's so exciting. Yeah, amazing. Good luck with it. I'm sure it'll be extremely helpful. So you just managed to get did the government step in at that point, or how did that how did that come about?
It was a bit of a uphill battle. The government has not come in yet. This was all through private philanthropy. So there's an organization here called Hawaii Community Foundation that raised a lot of money after the fires. And they're going to support the operational costs to cover free float therapy for everyone on the island.
That's amazing.
And a lot of local businesses and construction companies kind of stepped in to help get us to the finish line.
Oh, amazing. Oh, well, hopefully we can bring more awareness to it with this as well. And yeah, that's incredible work. Will you be doing studies as well during that? Will you be, really? Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Wow.
so, we're actually trying to use this as a proof of principle
Yeah.
that you could deploy float therapy to a disaster zone and mitigate PTSD. And,
Yeah. Wow.
to me, this has never been tested in the wild. And, the 10,000-foot view of all of this is if we could show a success story using research data that we collect in Maui, we could then very quickly replicate this elsewhere. So, for example, if we already had several of these shipping containers ready to go, we could have already had these in Los Angeles, for example, after their fires. And, to me, the million-dollar question is if you could deploy this fast enough after a traumatic event and get people floating in the weeks and months following that on a regular basis, can you actually prevent PTSD from forming? That's really the idea, is can you get the nervous system into such a state of equilibrium post-trauma that there is no PTSD.
Wow, that would be that would be incredible. Has that been demonstrated in any other modality? Because that would be really
It
a
has
revolution.
not, and in general, trauma treatments tend not to start until the chronic phase, which in my view is maybe already too late. Chronic PTSD could go on for decades, and you really want to sort of prevent that spiraling into this like long-term vicious state. So that's kind of what we're trying to do with the Maui Calm project is in essence create a real proof of principle that this is something that could be disseminated in the real world and really help a community trauma. And we don't speak about community traumas enough because it wasn't until recently where these have become so commonplace. I mean, the rate at which we're having these mega fires and these massive conflicts all around the world has just gone up exponentially uh, the past decade, really. And now it's happening everywhere, every year, somewhere else. And so I think what we need to really do as a society is say to ourselves, if you're going to have thousands and thousands of people in an entire community traumatized by these horrible events, these disasters and conflicts, what could we do as a society to stop that community from sort of entering this spiral of PTSD? And we really don't have a lot of scalable solutions, especially in rural areas like we're at in Maui. So I think this is what excites me the most about the Maui Calm project is this is actually a scalable solution.
Yeah, definitely. Where I am actually in Australia now, I'm at the edge of the rainforest, but obviously we suffered with really bad
You had the
uh,
bushfires, right?
fires too. Yeah,
Oh,
and floods as well. It's getting, yeah, I think Australia is getting hit quite badly, particularly in the north, and that feels, yeah, it's just like the other options are just not, they're not good. There's just issues with a lot of the other options, it seems. And
the
yeah,
standard way our medical system tries to help post trauma is they try to medicate the stress away. And oftentimes using these highly addictive drugs like benzodiazepines, SSRIs, SNRIs. And to me, what the data actually shows is these drugs are more likely causing more harm than good, especially with their addictive properties, the horrible withdrawal symptoms. And they're really just providing a band-aid for a much deeper problem. And what we need to be doing is find ways to use natural interventions that have been, tested over thousands and thousands of years, like mindfulness and meditation, right? And really deploy that at scale to a population that has been impacted. And that's what I think our society needs to figure out how to do better is how do we deploy things in a rapid fashion across an entire community in need?
I know you've talked about like the Navy and some of the military use flow therapy. Are they also using it for PTSD, or is theirs predominantly just for learning, for
No,
accelerated learning?
it definitely is for PTSD, also TBI or traumatic brain injury, and also for elite performance in special forces. So the original military unit that started with float therapy was the Navy SEALs, the active duty Navy SEALs. And it's now expanded to other special forces and other military units all the way into the Air Force even. They're using this in active duty military. My background actually is in veterans. And I worked for many years at the VA hospital in San Diego with veterans who had PTSD. And to me, I feel like this is an area that is missing. Right now, veterans want to get therapy or treatment for PTSD. The most common available treatments by the VA hospital are different types of psychotherapy, like prolonged exposure therapy and cognitive processing therapy, or medications like SSRIs, and that is it.
What what are they? What are those therapies?
So prolonged exposure therapy, I was trained in. I think it's a fantastic therapy, but it's very difficult because it forces you to confront some of your deepest fears. It forces you to talk about the trauma in a very visceral way. You don't avoid it at all. You go head on into it, and you teach the nervous system how to overcome the trauma through exposure to various cues and triggers and to the actual memory of the trauma itself. Cognitive processing therapy is more dealing with the thought processes that come following a traumatic event and trying to correct the dysfunctional thought processes. And then, SSRIs and SNRIs are just looking at this from a chemical point of view, trying to upregulate, different chemical systems like the serotonergic system and the norepinephrine system in the brain. So, these treatments work in about anywhere from a quarter to half of the patients with PTSD, which means the majority are actually not getting better. And this is a big problem. A lot of veterans are looking for other therapies, other treatments. I think right now, a hot topic in America, at least, is psychedelic assisted therapies, and veterans are navigating that. It's a slow process here in America. A lot of veterans are having to go to other countries to try these types of therapies. But I think what that shows me more than anything is there's a desperation. There's a desperation in the veteran community for novel solutions to these chronic problems like PTSD. And to me, this is once again where I feel something like flotation therapy or breath work is missing from the ecosystem of the VA. And I would love to find a way to get it there. I'll never forget, Josh, right? When I was working at the VA, this was going back, 10, 15 years ago. This was right after, vets were coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, 18, 19, 20 years old, and they're just a shell of themselves. They have a whole life ahead of them, but they're a shell of themselves. And by the time they get to me, they've probably, lost a lot of their friendships. Their significant other or their partner may have divorced them or told them either you go get help or I'm going to divorce you. They're oftentimes in the spiral of addiction, so they're self-medicating with alcohol and other drugs. And by the time they get to me, they're at rock bottom, right? Well, I would talk to them about their symptoms. I would go through all of their background. And at the end of that session, I would look at them and I'd say, guess what? You have PTSD. I diagnosed them with post-traumatic stress disorder. And you would see this look on their face of, I knew it, I knew it. Everyone's been telling me, I knew this was what's going on. Okay, doc, how could I get better? Let's go, I'm ready to start. And I would have to look at them, and I kid you not, this would bring tears to my eyes, and tell them that there was a 4-month wait list before we could get them into therapy. And there's a constant wait list to see one-on-one therapists. And this is a perennial issue at the VA and elsewhere. And so what I would have loved more than anything in those moments is to turn to that veteran and say, listen, we're going to get you into therapy in a few months. But between now and then, every single week, I'm going to be having you floating in this pool to really reduce your sympathetic arousal, try to calm your nervous system, and get your nervous system ready and prepared to handle therapy in a few months. This is how it should have gone. This is really what excites me the most about something as simple as float therapy, is these could be deployed anywhere. It could be deployed at hospitals. It could be deployed in battlefields or conflict zones. It could be deployed in fire-stricken sites like Maui Calm. So I think what I'm starting to recognize is there's these large holes in our healthcare system when it comes to dealing with things like chronic stress. And we need to find novel interventions that don't have side effects, that don't have these horrible addictive properties like the medical system that we currently have in Western medicine. We got to stop this vicious cycle of pill popping and addiction. It's really a catastrophic outcome for what's been going on for several decades now in America, just trying to medicate our problems away. And we need novel interventions that give people resilience. I think resilience is not spoken about nearly enough, but what our society needs now more than ever is the ability to handle stress. And if we aren't resilient, this is where things like PTSD really start spiraling. So I think the best thing we could do as a society is figure out how could we shift our medical system away from trying to put Band-Aids on things that are chronic issues and much more towards the side of preventative medicine. This is really, to me, I think the next phase of medicine is how could we, as a society, instill tools and trades and technologies that will help the nervous system become more resilient and able to handle adversity better. This, I think, is going to be key for the next century.
Yeah, it's such an interesting point, actually, because I would consider myself quite an avid floater. And when you put it from that perspective, it's like it's not just healthy people that can benefit. It's actually the other group of people that could benefit even more. And actually, I think I've probably undervalued the importance of it because the the main thing that comes up is expensive to set up, but actually it's actually quite cheap to set up when you look at it from that perspective because there's just so many people that can benefit. Literally, I would say probably nearly the entire population from that perspective. I think we should still focus on that group first, or the groups that are suffering the most first. But
And this is
yeah, if you
exactly
just
what we
comment.
found, Josh, in our research studies, is the more stress and the more anxiety you bring into the float experience, the more effective the float session. So in other words, healthy people who are very relaxed at baseline, they go into a float, it feels pretty good, but it's not earth-shattering. You bring somebody with high stress, high anxiety into a float session, that's when somebody comes out and they look like a whole new person. It really resets their nervous system in a way that pretty much nothing else has worked at in the past. And all of a sudden, they feel like, in some ways, they describe it like they've been reset. Like they're getting a taste of themselves that they haven't felt or tasted in years. And they're shocked. A lot of the patients in our studies, they would come out and they would have this sort of deer in headlights look of, what just happened? I just lied down in this, comfortable environment for an hour and all of a sudden I feel great. Like, what did you do? What's in that magic pool? Like, it has to be something more, right? And you could just tell, like, their wheels are spinning because these are patients who've been suffering for oftentimes years or decades. A lot of people don't realize that anxiety is really one of the most chronic conditions on earth. It tends to start in adolescence and it could last a lifetime for certain people. And so these were the patients that we were working with in our studies, and they had tried a lot of different modalities. They had tried psychotherapy. They had tried the standard medications. They had tried drugs. They had tried things like meditation and yoga. And it was a big struggle. I think that's something we should talk about maybe if you want to, but I think the anxious nervous system struggles with mindfulness and meditation because it's wired to be perpetually stuck in this future-oriented state. It's very difficult to be grounded in the present moment when your nervous system is wired for the future, right? And this is the perennial issue for people with chronic stress, chronic anxiety. How do you get them to come back to the present moment? Get their nervous system to come back to the present moment. And this is where you really do need bridges. And I think flotation therapy is one of the most important bridges our society has right now. But most people have never heard of it, and very few have ever walked across it.
Thank you so much for listening so far. I just wanted to take a quick moment to jump in and give you an update from the FitMind team. So we recently launched an incredible new course, which is free in the app, which is the preferred approach, and also on YouTube. It's called 30 Days of Meditation, Science, and Bliss. And this has combined what we feel is the most effective contemplative practices with what we feel is the most important of the science. Honestly, I can't believe the course is free. It's genuinely incredible and has changed my life. Also, FitMind recently transitioned to an NGO. So if there is any way that you can help us at all, we now survive entirely off donations. And even if you can't afford to help out financially, if you could just give us a like or share this podcast or the course with anyone that it might help. Our goal here is simply just to help as many people as we can. We thank you so much. Now, back to the episode. What's your theory on how that works? Because yeah, I spoke to Shamil Shandaria recently, and he comes at it from a kind of predictive processing perspective, where it's like each time we come back or we create mindfulness, then we're undoing these prediction errors, which would be what led to, say, like anxiety or depression. Essentially, we're painting the world from a perspective that's not necessarily true, or it's not close to reality. For instance, if I'm worrying about money and then my partner comes in and asks, I don't know, about going out somewhere. I have a fear response about going out to this particular place for something that's completely unrelated. I don't want to see these people because, I'm thinking about what that scenario might be. So yeah, I wonder what's your perspective on how that's working with float therapy? Because it's interesting. You don't necessarily need training to go into. Well, you don't need training, as you said, to go into a float tank. So it's really interesting that it works itself almost. You become your own therapist.
It's true, and I think a lot about the mechanistic basis of float therapy. And in my mind, I don't think it's a single mechanism at work. I actually think it's multiple pathways towards this, salubrious outcome. And a couple different mechanisms. Obviously, you were talking about prediction errors. And I've written a few papers about this from the interoceptive perspective, which is the brain is constantly, every moment of the day, getting input from the internal world of our body, especially the visceral body, the heart, the lungs, the gut. This is the primary source of input from the internal body to the brain. And the brain's constantly trying to figure out what is the ideal set point or homeostatic state, if you will, to keep the nervous system always a step ahead, right? So it's always trying to predict the next moment, and then the next moment, and the next moment. And so this predictive machinery of our brain tends to go haywire in the cases of chronic stress and anxiety and other mental health conditions as well. And your predictions are kind of out of line with what is actually happening in the present moment, the actual sensory input coming into the brain in the present moment, right, is almost always out of whack and out of sync with what is actually happening in the present moment. So you're up here thinking that, saber-toothed tigers are coming out of the bushes, and in reality, you're sitting in a beautiful temperature-controlled room with all of your basic needs taken care of, food in the refrigerator, TV to distract you from everything, and computers. And there's really nothing to fear or stress out about at all in the present moment. So you got to figure out a way to correct that mismatch, right? And what I love about float therapy is it gets rid of a lot of those predictions just by virtue of minimizing all of the sensory input to the brain. So all of that visual input, all of that auditory input, all of that proprioceptive input coming from our body and space, that gets minimized. And so for the first time, all of those cortices in our brain, the primary visual cortices, the primary auditory cortices, all the proprioceptive cortices, they're not getting sensory input. It's amazing. In a well-calibrated float tank or float pool, you could have your eyes open or closed, and you're not going to be able to discern the difference. It's one of the few moments in life where you really can't tell. And so I think that by itself is one mechanism how floating is working, is just by virtue of minimizing all of those threats and stressors from the external world. All of a sudden, the nervous system gets a respite from that stimulation, and it could just calm down. It could go into sort of a relaxed physiological state. And so that brings me to the second mechanism, which is relaxation. We just published a paper a couple of years ago showing that floating, like almost reflexively, like you take a hammer to the patella, right? And all of a sudden the knee and the leg goes up, right? Floating, you put the nervous system into this novel environment, right? Where you have no input coming from the outside world. And all of a sudden, the entire autonomic nervous system goes into this relaxed physiological state. And everybody we've ever tested in this, and trust me, it was not trivial to measure physiological signals in the float environment. You're in the world's saltiest pool of water, and both salt and water do not go well with electrical sensors. So it took us a long time to figure out how to measure these signals in the float environment, but we actually did, and we've published the results. And what we found is quite rapidly, within the first 5 to 10 minutes of a float session, your blood pressure precipitously drops 10 to 15 points, especially diastolic blood pressure.
What are the points? Is that 1 to 100 or 0 to 100 or?
It's a range. A typical, for example, diastolic blood pressure that's considered good would be somewhere around 80 millimeters of mercury or less. Okay.
Yeah.
And right now, if you have a diastolic blood pressure, say, of 90, you're considered hypertensive. This was a new shift by the medical associations pretty recently. And a lot of people have a diastolic blood pressure around 90. So that means a lot of people are on this trajectory towards chronic hypertension. And what we found in the float pool is within 10 to 15 minutes, your diastolic blood pressure reduces by about 10 points. And it stays that way for the remainder of the float. Your systolic blood pressure drops by about 5 to 10 points, so a little bit less, but still significant. Your respiratory rate drops by about a breath a minute. And we're not telling people to modulate their breathing. It's just being in that environment naturally slows your respiration. And I know a breath a minute sounds subtle, but there's been published studies on long-term meditators by Richie Davidson's groups and others showing that at baseline, long-term meditators who've meditated thousands of hours have a baseline breathing rate about a breath a minute slower than average.
Wow.
So just lowering your respiration just by a breath a minute on average could have tremendous impact. We looked at heart rate variability changes, and we showed a significant increase in high frequency heart rate variability, which is a marker of the parasympathetic nervous system. And then to me, one of the biggest things we saw physiologically in the body was this tremendous reduction in muscle tension. You think how much of our stress in life, right, is being harbored in the musculature of our body, especially around the spinal cord, in the neck, in the back, in the lower back, right? This is oftentimes where we harbor our stress and tension. And the float environment did an amazing job of sort of evaporating all of that tension away from the skeletal muscles of the body in a way that, is quite difficult to do, say, with standard forms of therapy like psychotherapy, right? So much of psychotherapy is in the head, right? It's missing the body component. But what we don't realize is you got to treat the trauma and stress in the body if you want the whole person to get better. You can't just correct the thinking. I think in a lot of ways, psychiatry and psychology for the past few decades has been so focused up here that we've missed the bodily component. And what excites me the most is actually there's a whole representation of the body within the brain. And those maps of the body, especially the visceral body, are what seem to be the most disturbed in cases of anxiety and stress. And so this brings me now to the third mechanism, and the final mechanism I'll talk about for why I think float therapy is so effective at reducing stress and anxiety. And this is a little paradoxical. So, tell me if this gets a little confusing. In our first set of studies with float therapy, we targeted a very specific population of people with anxiety. They had what's known as high anxiety sensitivity. Okay? Anxiety sensitivity in some ways could be conceptualized as your fear of fear, or your fear of feeling anxious. All right? So just to give you a palpable example of what this might mean, right? Somebody with high anxiety sensitivity, a classic case, would be somebody with panic disorder who all of a sudden starts feeling their heart palpitating, right? And what their mind quickly thinks is, oh my goodness, I'm dying. I'm having a heart attack. And they rush to the emergency room and they do every single test on this person known to man, and it all comes back normal. But the person says, no, I'm dying. I feel my heart. Something's wrong. I can't breathe. My heart's gonna, stop beating soon. You got to help me. They really, at that moment, feel as if they're dying, right? But it turns out it's just their sensitivity to the visceral sensations like the heartbeat or the breath. They're hypersensitive. And all of a sudden they feel those sensations and it starts spiraling into this vicious cycle of panic and anxiety, right? So our first set of people that we floated were these people with extremely high anxiety sensitivity. Now here's the paradox. A lot of people refer to float therapy as sensory deprivation. And I think this is a misnomer. It's a horrible description. And the reason is because we discovered that when you're in a float environment, you see a significant enhancement of your internal sensations like the heartbeat and the breath. In fact, when you reduce and remove the outside world, all of a sudden the internal world of the body comes to life. You could feel your heart beating. You could feel your breath with exquisite sensitivity. I meditated for many years before I floated. And you would go to these retreats where they would have you focus on the breath, right? Just the breath. And all you would do for hours and hours every day is just focus on the sensation of the breath coming in, going out, again and again. And when I got into my first float, that came to life. Just to give you a concrete example, my first meditation retreat was like 3 days long. And you're meditating 10, 12 hours a day, easy, sometimes 14 hours. And maybe in that long chunk of time, you get like 30 seconds or a minute of the entire day where your attention is just focused on the sensation of the breath and nothing else. You're not thinking about the future. You're not thinking about the past. You're just purely immersed in present moment awareness, maybe for 30 to 60 seconds. For me, after a whole day of meditating, you hit that 30 to 60 seconds, you're like, oh my goodness, that's amazing. Well, when I got into a float tank, I didn't have to try. It was like the spotlight of awareness just focused in right on the breath. And suddenly I wasn't just feeling it right here underneath the nose. It was going into the nose, and I could feel the breath going down the esophagus, down the windpipe into the trachea. That's how exquisite the sensation is when you're floating. You could track the breath from beginning to end. You could feel the temperature differences as the air comes into the body and then gets slightly warmed up during the exhalation process. You could see that loop from beginning to end, and the breath all of a sudden could be this anchor point, and you can't stop thinking about the breath. It's just there. So anyways, this is a part of floating that I think gets missed with all this talk of sensory deprivation. It's missing this critical piece, which is your internal body, what we call interoceptive awareness, actually gets enhanced during the flotation experience. So now let's go back full circle to these people with high anxiety sensitivity. And the third mechanism as to why I think floating is having such profound anti-anxiety effects. You have people who have this exquisite fear of their visceral sensations, right? Of their heartbeat and their breath. And now we're going to put them into this environment where literally all they feel is those visceral sensations like the heartbeat and the breath. If you asked my colleagues 10 years ago, before I started this line of research, what would happen in this situation, they may have said this is a recipe for disaster. They're going to panic. They're going to go crazy. They're going to jump out of the float tank. Right? No. It turns out there's a great theory that started many decades ago, really one of the founding theories of psychology, behavioral psychology in the sense of cognitive behavioral therapy. This was Joseph Wolpe, who many view as the founder of CBT. He was kind of the earliest version of behavioral therapy. And he had a concept called reciprocal inhibition, which essentially, I won't go into the details, but essentially is about the basic biological fact that the nervous system can't be anxious and relaxed at the same time. There's this inhibition, if you will, that when you're physiologically relaxed, it's very difficult to also feel anxious at the same time. All right? That was my prediction. My prediction was that if you put somebody with extreme anxiety sensitivity into a float environment, and all of a sudden, those interoceptive sensations of the heartbeat and the breath that are now at the front and center of conscious awareness are paired with a relaxed physiological state where your blood pressure is down 10 to 15 points, your muscle tension is completely dissipated away, your heart rate is in perfect variability, right? Your brain waves are lowered to an all-time minimal low. Now, all of a sudden, these interoceptive sensations have a brand new association. Instead of being paired with stress and anxiety like they normally are in the real world, now these interoceptive sensations are paired with a state of relaxation. And this, I think, has profound therapeutic benefit, because when they feel these sensations in the real world again, suddenly it has this whole new association where they don't have to run to the emergency room and feel like they're having a panic attack. In fact, what they could realize is they're in a state of complete flow and relaxation. And this is very powerful for somebody with high anxiety sensitivity. And so, we did our first set of experiments, and it turned out exactly as I predicted. They did not panic. They did not run out of the float pool. In fact, they loved the experience. They didn't want to get out of the float pool. They stayed in there longer than we ever expected. In fact, we just published a study last year where we said, okay, let's take patients with pretty severe anxiety and PTSD and anxiety sensitivity and let them select, what is your preferred duration for floating? You could float for 5 minutes, you could float for several hours. You get to decide. And when you ask them before the float, and you say to somebody with anxiety or PTSD, you're going to go into this room all by yourself, and there's going to be nothing but you, your body, and your thoughts. How long do you think you would like to stay in there? How long do you think they would say, Josh?
I would imagine it wasn't much.
On average, about 10 to 15 minutes tops. They said, we're out of there. And for most people with anxiety, they're constantly sort of running away from themselves. They don't like to sit with their own thoughts. They're constantly trying to distract themselves from their stress and their anxiety. But what was amazing in this study, and this was the first time that the National Institute of Health had actually funded a float study. But one of the basic questions they wanted to know is, what is the preferred duration of floating in somebody with anxiety and PTSD? And it turns out it was 75 minutes. It was 25% longer than our prescribed duration, which was an hour float, okay? They actually wanted to be in there for 75 minutes, which I thought was so incredible, to get somebody with severe anxiety and PTSD to be in this environment where they could just focus on themselves and meditate and feel their internal body in this relaxed physiological state. And they could do it for an entire 75 minutes. And I didn't have to tell them they had to. It was their preferred duration.
Yeah, that's huge.
So anyways, this to me was such a groundbreaking finding, to take somebody who normally associates nothing but fear and panic with the experience of their internal body. So when they feel their heartbeat, when they feel their breath, right? The first thing they think, the first association that comes to mind is something is wrong. I'm dying. I need to run away, right? This is the instinctual thought that comes to mind with these interoceptive sensations. And now they could feel these sensations and have this whole new association. That's incredible to me. And, in fact, you're seeing manifestations of this already happening in the real world in elite performers. One of the best basketball players that have ever walked the earth is Steph Curry. And there's actually a commercial of him floating, and he's been known to float now for quite a few years. And what he talks about isn't floating as just this tool to help with, recovery after an intense workout or game, right? He says what it helps him with is how to stay calm in the face of the storm. And by storm, I mean, imagine you're Steph Curry, only 1 minute left. Everybody in the crowd is looking at you. The pressure is on. Your adrenaline is shooting through the moon. Your heart is beating out of the chest, right? And what happens to most of us, right? In those situations, we go for the shot and we totally screw it up, right? It's like the adrenaline gets the best of us. We can't concentrate. We can't focus. We can't stay calm, right? And now look at Steph Curry, somebody who's done this again and again in these last minute situations. And he shoots that shot, and you look at his face, and he is so cool. He is cool as a cucumber. And yet he makes it all the time. And he talks about floating giving him the ability to do that. And it's because of this mechanism of reciprocal inhibition. Suddenly he feels his heart palpitating. And where most of us would go to, oh my God, we're being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, he goes back to the float tank and back to that reduced blood pressure, that reduced muscle tension. And he could feel his heart beating, and he could stay calm in the face of the storm. And you're seeing this in other athletes like Novak Djokovic, who every time he goes to the Australian Open, guess what he's going to at the same time? He's floating every day. I know it because I know all the float centers in Australia who host him.
I saw them upload pictures of him. Yeah.
So all of the elite performers are recognizing that this is actually a superhuman strength. If these visceral associations are what create our experience of stress and anxiety, and suddenly you could have this whole new association that's linked to the visceral sensations. Oh my goodness, what a powerful, powerful skill that is. And I think floating really teaches your brain how to learn this skill. It's not something that comes easy, I could tell you that. And even after many years of meditation, I never was able to quite get there the way that float therapy was able to sort of get me there, where suddenly these visceral sensations lose their power over you. And you could redirect them in these entirely novel ways. So I think this is something that is not spoken about nearly enough with flotation therapy. Everyone always talks about sensory deprivation, which once again, I hate that term. Because in fact, what's happening in the float environment is you're enhancing the most important sensations on earth, which is the sensations from your inner body.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I have found that as well. And a little bit of what you're talking about, we would call equanimity, which, I mean, there's a scale of equanimity, but well, it's a very desired state, at least in the practice that we partake in. And it is quite difficult. Like you'll go through different stages first, and eventually we'll come to equanimity. And then there's varying degrees of this to the point that you feel that almost anything could happen to you and you would be unmoved by it. And it's quite a surprising state when it does happen because it's so different to at least my normal state. And the tank does seem to accelerate it. And the weird and surprising thing is that it doesn't stop when you get out. And it also doesn't stop when I wake up the next day. It's often like, it's like, oh wow, that's still there. That's still the downregulated nervous system, the feeling of resilience, the feeling of health. And weirdly, well-being just seems to spontaneously arise. Like you're unconditionally happy. And then to go back to the sort of prediction era, like description, it's like the prediction of what you think might happen, like the reality is becoming much closer and
And we
resilient.
measured this, Josh. So we actually did a study and published it last year where we tracked how long do the benefits last after a float session is over. And this really was surprising to me as well, because you would think, okay, during the float experience, you're in this very serene, well-calibrated environment, right? Where you're in basically a state of homeostasis. We're talking about equanimity. This is like equanimity for the nervous system, which, really is homeostasis, right? And, to me, this makes sense that during the float, you would feel this relaxed state, okay? That makes sense. But what you're talking about is different. Now you leave the float environment, you go back into the real world. How quick does your nervous system revert back to its typical prediction errors, right? It's typical moment-to-moment functioning. But it turns out it doesn't just revert back right away. We actually measured significant anti-anxiety and anti-stress effects that were lasting over 2 days 48 hours. In fact, we didn't go out long enough. We should have gone out to 72 hours because we didn't measure long enough. So we don't actually know how long the effects go, but we know at least 1 to 2 days post float, you're still in that sort of float state, which I thought was amazing. You take somebody with severe anxiety, you give them a benzodiazepine like Xanax, right? They pop the pill, 4 hours, maybe 8 hours later, the anxiety that the pill helped with is percolating back up, right? 4 hours or maybe 8 hours later, that's how long the anti-anxiety benefits last for a classic benzo like Xanax. Float actually lasted for 48 hours. To me, that difference is enormous, and it didn't require any pharmaceutical. It didn't require a highly addictive drug like Xanax. And the patients I was working with, they had used Xanax. And know what they said is they said, listen, they would come out of the float. They'd say, listen, whatever you did in there was just as powerful of an anti-anxiety effect as taking a Xanax, but I don't have all of these side effects. I don't feel like I'm in this fog or sedated state. A lot of people who take Xanax a lot, they talk about feeling zombified, right? In fact, what my patients said is for the first time in their life, they came out and they felt clear-headed, clear-minded. They could think and see things with new clarity, which is very different than a sedated state like a Xanax or benzo-induced state would create. So that's very powerful. Not only are we seeing effects that outlast the gold standard benzos, but we're not seeing all of these negative side effects that come with a gold standard benzo. So, that is very, very powerful. What I'm trying to actually do eventually, we're going to have to fundraise in order to do this, but I would like to do a head-to-head study directly comparing the effects of float therapy to Xanax in people with severe anxiety. And I bet you we're going to win this thing. It's going to cost a lot of money to do a proper randomized controlled trial. But if we could do it in a rigorous way, we could show that we could do this just as good, if not better, than a benzo. Floating is being misperceived by the public. This word sensory deprivation, once again, is causing people not to recognize that, in fact, what floating is the perfect backdrop, both from a sensory state and a physiological state, from which to practice meditation. And it creates this amazing bridge where suddenly people who normally would struggle to meditate could access these mindful states almost reflexively, spontaneously, without any effort. And that to me is so important. If we could create a bridge to teach the human population how to access these mindful states, that could be the most important bridge we ever create as a society.
Yeah, I agree. It does seem that meditation spontaneously arises. Obviously, a big pointer in meditation is that awareness is always underlying whatever is happening. And I think in the tank it becomes extremely obvious, particularly it feels just very open and spacious, particularly as the body can tend to start to dissolve, and the temperature is nice and it's very comfortable. I tend to notice in a lot of focus we put in our practices on the tension in the mind we talked about, and the body as well, but I'll often find there'll be some form of resistance to what is happening in the brain. And usually as soon as I get in the tank, the first thing I notice is actually I've got a bit of tension. It feels like tension in the brain, which is kind of weird because I don't think there is a way of sensing necessarily tension in the brain. But what I tend to think it is just a level of resistance to what is happening. And that's what I'm perceiving. But yeah, it's extremely interesting that does just spontaneously arise when you're in the tank.
The other thing that you just brought up is, I hate to say this, but a fourth mechanism for how floating is actually working. And this involves out-of-body experiences. When you're in a well-calibrated float pool, the temperature of the water is calibrated to your skin temperature. So it's a few degrees cooler than core. It's about 95 degrees Fahrenheit, or I think around, that would convert to around 35 degrees Celsius. And what you then do is match the temperature of the air and humidity to the same temperature as the water. All right. And then when the lights are off and you can't see your body, and when the temperature is so perfect that there's no difference between air, body, and water, suddenly you lose track with where your body begins and where it ends. It literally immerses with the world around it. And it's a really fascinating feeling. It's unlike anything you could get on Earth. Like, to me, I think the only other place maybe you would get such a sensation is outer space, or maybe scuba diving in the deep sea. I don't know. But beyond those two things, I think floating is really out of this world when it comes to out-of-body experiences. And it creates this amazing dissociative state where suddenly the external body is no longer there, has no boundaries, and all that's left is the internal body, the visceral body that we've been talking about, your heartbeat and your breath. And this simple form of sentience becomes essentially the only existence that matters at that moment of a float. And so we just published a study last year with my colleague Mark Whitman in Germany. He started a laboratory in Freiburg, Germany, a float laboratory. And he's doing some incredible experiments on altered states of consciousness. And one of the biggest things he found that mediates the anxiolytic effect of floating is this dissolution of body boundaries, this out-of-body experience. And I think that's a really a powerful piece of the mechanism behind why floating is having an anxiolytic effect. So once again, I don't think I could pin it on any one single mechanism, but there are these four fascinating mechanisms that we've discussed today that all have a powerful role to play.
That's really interesting that it's correlated with that effect, because obviously in the psychedelic studies they find correlation between like the quote unquote mystical experience and reduction in addiction and anxiety, and I find just the body disappearing is I mean, I'm not sure if the term is a great one, but like it feels like a mystical experience.
Wow.
It's an extremely, I mean, it's a big relief for one, but it's also like, wow, consciousness is so interesting.
And we did this in women with anorexia nervosa. Imagine a population where all they could think about is their external body, and their entire life is consumed by trying to get the external body to look a certain way, to the point that they are no longer eating. And now suddenly, for the first time in life, this population of women with severe anorexia nervosa no longer feels their body. Guess what happens?
They change behaviorally somehow.
Not only does their anxiety go down, right? The nervosa part of anorexia nervosa, we actually see an improvement in their body image. One of the biggest issues with women who have anorexia nervosa is they are objectively skinny. They're malnourished, right? They're underweight. But when you ask them, they actually say, I feel fat. That's how they feel, even though objectively they are not. They're exactly the opposite. Post float, they felt more like their true selves. They didn't feel that feeling of being fat anymore. And we showed that those effects actually persevered for 6 months after floating had come to a stop. So it shifted their body image. So, think about that. We were talking about earlier, by virtue of removing, dissolving the outer body, right? It just disappears. Suddenly, afterwards, they feel their real body in a truer form and fashion. I think that's very, very profound. And my colleague Saib Khalsa at UCLA was really the linchpin behind these studies with anorexia nervosa. And I think it's going to be a groundbreaking new treatment for this body image disturbance piece.
That's incredible. What do you make of that? Because that means that, that opens up just so many other like potential avenues to address, because it's behavioral. Like, but I wonder, would it just be body image related effects? I don't think so, because if the effect is happening in other, yeah, like addiction perhaps, or depression or anxiety. Yeah, I wonder how what do you make of that actually? Because a big focus obviously is changing our behaviors, and this leads to just many other positive effects. We often can become kinder, more caring, more present with loved ones, which becomes a sort of positive feedback loop, um, and can make us happier in just so many other ways.
That's right.
So yeah, I wonder what do you make of the mechanism or effect of that?
You know, I think this does harken back to what we were speaking about originally with the prediction errors. Our nervous system is wired for survival. It's always trying to stay a step ahead of nature and all the threats that nature presents to us. And I think what happens post float is the nervous system becomes a truer reflection of the environment in which it exists. So, in other words, it's not being constantly pulled and tugged by the contingencies of the external world, right? All these stressors and threats that we're facing every day, or we think we're facing, but aren't actually in our immediate environment. Maybe it's just a thought that we're having, or maybe it's something on a social media post that we're seeing happening in a far off land, but it's not actually happening in the here and now of our immediate environment. And all of a sudden, post float, you could start to take in things more. Colors become brighter and richer. Sounds become much more pleasant. The taste suddenly becomes palpable. And all of those present moment sensations become, in some ways, enriched by that float experience. And so all of a sudden, mindfulness and flow states, and as you were talking about, feelings of positivity and well being, that comes to surface. I think it actually brings our nervous system into the state that we were always meant to be in. But the world around us has caused so much havoc, right? Constantly causing an earthquake to our nervous system with all the crap happening day in and day out, right? And all of a sudden, floating kind of brings us back to baseline, back to where we once were. And now we could experience that world from those fresh eyes again, right?
That's incredible and extremely exciting. I know that you've been using an adapted EEG device, and you've been measuring, I think there was increase in alpha and theta. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what those brain waves are like subjectively. What would we expect to be like, and what's the effect that you've been measuring there?
So, originally we thought it was alpha and theta that would have the biggest effect inside of a float environment. And part of the reason for that is when you look at studies on meditation and relaxation, that tends to be the two most prominent brainwaves that you'll see emerge. But in fact, what we found was totally different, and once again surprised us. We were seeing delta waves. And I have to credit Joel Froelich and Ricardo Gil da Costa from Neuroverse, which is the system we use. These are really novel wireless waterproof EEG systems, sit right here on the forehead. And for the first time, we were able to measure signals of the brain in this novel environment. And what we found were an enhancement of delta power. Typically, the only time you see an enhancement of delta power in the human brain is during a state of deep sleep, deep non-REM sleep, deep restorative sleep when you're totally unconscious. And the amazing part is we were measuring these brain waves while people were awake and conscious. So it's one of the few times in your conscious life where your nervous system is fluctuating at this extremely low level of 1 to 2 cycles a second. It's barely ticking. Your brain is just barely fluttering. It's the lowest state you could go before you're dead. So, to me, this is quite amazing. You're inducing sort of a deep rest in the brain in a way that normally could only be achieved in a state of deep sleep, but you're awake and you're conscious during the flow.
That's interesting. Is that
And by the way, we're
state?
still working on publishing these data. So these are brand new data.
Oh, amazing. First luck. Is that a state where you would process memories, or is it more like a dream state?
I think almost the opposite. So when you're in dream state, they call that, paradoxical, because it's like you're awake. Your brain's fluctuating, 15, 20, 25 cycles a second in a state or a waveform they call beta state, right? The beta waves. But when you're in a deep rest, there may be consolidation of memories happening at some level, but you're not triggering those memories. You're not conscious necessarily of them. It's almost like a tabula rasa. That's what I would equate it to. It's a blank slate. Your nervous system is just sitting there waiting for something to paint the landscape, right? But nothing's coming in. And so the landscape is just a blank slate. And that's very unusual. And what I like to say to people when they ask, what is it like to float? I say, imagine you have this blank slate of a nervous system before your eyes, and you could now paint anything you want. You could visualize things. Athletes oftentimes will say they go into a float environment and they'll visualize. You could fall asleep. I know a lot of people who float and they go into deep sleep. Or you could do things like meditate and focus on your visceral sensations like the breath. And that becomes the center of your awareness on that blank canvas. It's just the in and out of the breath, the in and out of the beat of the heart, the thump thump. That is what is on the blank slate. So in other words, you could use this for whatever you want. It's your tabula rasa that the float environment has given you as a gift. And now you could paint whatever you would like.
Yeah, that's interesting. A lot of the subjective effect I will notice. I'll see myself dipping down to near sleep and then jump back up into that sort of
A
state.
very liminal state, right?
It's incredible. So you've also researched the effect on the amygdala activity. Can you talk a little bit about that? What the amygdala is? I think we've covered some of the effects that might have on anxiety, but I'd love to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so those studies are still ongoing. I don't think we have a good sense yet of how floating is directly impacting the amygdala. To be completely honest, we had some early studies that were showing a dampening of amygdala activation, but we haven't been replicating that in larger data sets necessarily. I think part of the struggle is the technology of fMRI we were learning more recently is quite crude when it comes to individual differences. So being able, for example, to see changes in somebody's brain from pre-float to post-float, right? From time one to time two. It turns out the reliability of that signal is not very good in the amygdala or really almost any brain region. fMRI has, I would say, a relatively poor test retest reliability. And we didn't realize this till the past decade, where we had these extremely large data sets where you take the same person and you scan them twice on any given day at a given time and say, what happens? And it turns out what happens on time one doesn't have a very strong relationship with what happens in time two. So it becomes harder to use fMRI to discern what's happening in the brain in any intervention, whether it be floating or medications or behavioral therapy or psychotherapy. It doesn't matter because it's not a good tool for looking at individual differences. And this is something, like I said, we've really only learned in the past decade. We were very optimistic that you could use fMRI for these sorts of things 10 years ago, and as more data has come out, I'm quite a bit less optimistic. So it's harder for me to actually say what's happening in the amygdala because of this limitation of the method itself, using fMRI to detect changes. One area where we had a little more success is functional connectivity, which is looking at pre and post float changes in resting state functional connectivity. It tends to have a more reliable signal. And what we found is floating does tend to reduce the resting state functional connectivity of the default mode network, especially the posterior default mode. And the default mode has been more or less linked with this internal mind chatter, right? This constant voice in our heads that's always percolating and always thinking, right, about the past and the future. And even when we're not doing anything, the default mode network tends to be hyperactive at rest, especially in people with anxiety and depression, people who are constantly ruminating or struggling with worry, right? It tends to be related to this sort of hyperconnectivity within the default mode. And what we found from pre to post float is this significant reduction in default mode network connectivity, and especially in the posterior hubs, like the posterior cingulate, the parietal lobe, and in the somatosensory cortices as well, the areas that map both our external and internal body. So you're seeing this precipitous reduction in connectivity within these regions. And interestingly, this does overlap with the same reductions in connectivity you see in psychedelic studies like psilocybin, for example. And so we do think that this may be related to this concept of ego dissolution that is so fundamental. But essentially, it's the loosening of the thought processes, right? to the point where suddenly thoughts themselves evaporate. And what's left is just this very primal, basic version of yourself. What I like to think of as like pure sentience, right? It's just a very basic visceral awareness. And to me, I think that's what these neuroimaging data are telling us, is floating is sort of creating a nervous system state where you do see this ego dissolution, this external body dissolution as well. And you just have this very primordial sense of self that is left afterwards.
That's fascinating. That was my next question, actually. It's interesting that it's happening in the same way because, yeah, that seems to be at the core of the effects of the psychedelic experience, particularly in measurable effects afterwards, and also meditation as well. So I did think there would be correlation there. I wonder, you mentioned Richard Davies earlier. He also talks about in long term, a study he did on long term meditators. I think it was like real high level, like 40,000 hours, I think they had on
That's right.
average. They found that they were measuring gamma synchrony even when they were resting. How do you? I struggle to consolidate that with some of the other research because obviously gamma is an extremely high frequency brainwave. So, yeah, is there any way you can hypothesize or consolidate that with a lot of the other practices?
Yeah, you know, Antoine Lutz helped Ritchie with a lot of those early studies to find this gamma effect. And these are, you know, very, very experienced meditators. You know, people who, you know, were living in caves for years at a time, just meditating in temples and so forth every day. So I think they have a very unique nervous system, almost incomprehensible to even compare them to almost anybody else, because they you know, the way they interact with the world is just so different. But yeah, so you know, that was something that Ritchie found. We did not see that in our EEG data. Um, Once again, we saw the opposite. We saw these extremely low frequency states. Does that mean we wouldn't find gamma if, for example, we took long-term meditators and put them into a float environment? That we don't know. That study has not been done yet. The people we were studying were people with anxiety and PTSD who struggle to get into deep meditative states. And they were the ones entering into these very low frequency states. But perhaps if we took experienced meditators and allowed that float environment to give them that tabula rasa, maybe we would see a flourishing of high frequency gamma states. That'd be interesting.
Yeah, even non meditators, but long term
Oh
floaters
yeah,
might be
yeah. There you
big.
go. That would be another interesting group to look at. And you know, we wanted to do this study for many years, and you know, we still might do it, but we thought it would be so fun to just, you know, take a cohort of these experienced meditators like the Dalai Lama's group that Richie Davidson has been looking at, and just get them to a float center all over the course of a single weekend, where you could go to these, you know, giant float centers that have, you know, anywhere from 5 to 10 float tanks, and do a massive study in one weekend where you just get all of them to come and put on these EEG systems and do a marathon testing session.
That would be incredible. I hope to keep track of that as we move forward. I remember, I think it was, there's been a couple of instances of that, but I think it was Terence McKenna. He gave, I think, DMT to like a high llama. And then when he took it, he was just completely unsurprised by what happened. And it was just like as though there were, in one of them at least, there was no change. It was just the same and
Unbelievable.
no effect.
Unbelievable. Yeah, it's, you know, I think when you could teach your brain not to rely on predictive processing as its core mode of functioning, and not to let these erroneous priors get in the way of reality, which is oftentimes what's happening in these horrible mental health conditions like stress, chronic anxiety, chronic depression even. All of a sudden, the world, no matter what it throws at you, is going to be okay. You can maintain equanimity. You can maintain calm in the face of any storm. And I think that's what we're learning from these highly experienced meditators. That's what we're learning from people who float on a regular basis. This is what we're learning from people who practice things like breath work that help very quickly bring their nervous system into that state of equanimity or homeostasis, right? So this is, I think, a key skill that we have to learn how to teach society from a very early stage of life. I don't know about you, Josh, but I didn't start getting into some of these practices like floating and meditation and breath work till I was quite old. College was the beginning, and then I think floating not until I was in my postdoc. Really, if we want to be doing this correctly at the most efficient time to maximize benefit, you want to be doing this in children and teenagers. That's when the nervous system is developing. And if you could get the nervous system to develop in a salubrious way, suddenly you're going to shift the entire trajectory of that child or that teenager's life. 75% of mental health conditions start during childhood and adolescence. So if we could teach those basic skills at that critical time window, we could shift people's trajectory away from mental health and towards this state of mindfulness and mental wellness that is so missing from our children and adolescents right now. I got to say, the data is coming out on this young generation, and it is the scariest data I have ever seen as a psychologist. We are seeing rates of mental illness, anxiety, stress, depression, suicidality, body image disturbance, anorexia nervosa, higher than it's ever been. And the females in particular, the adolescent females, are really struggling. I can't emphasize that enough. The warning signs are all there. You could read a great book that just came out last year called The Anxious Generation, talks all about this, but the data is there. And this young generation really needs help. They need help. They are so damn connected to technology that their nervous system no longer knows how to disconnect. And this is where technologies like flotation therapy could become so helpful. And that's something we're actually going to study in Lahaina in all the teenagers who are struggling right now, not just with the constant connectivity of technology, but with these horrible fires that have completely ruined their lives and livelihoods.
Gosh, yeah, that's such a good idea. It does. I've never heard of a child floating for one, but I do worry about it often, even just driving around the street, how little or unusual it is to see a kid playing out these days. And the exposure to this level of addictive technology, of course, the kid doesn't know not to do it. And also the parents are trying to deal with the current stresses of life. So it's a very difficult situation to be in, but I think it's such a good idea to apply these technologies to kids, because it really, I mean, it clearly has long-term changes, the effects on the default mode network. And also you have a reference of how to regulate back into that state. So that would be really profound. I think that's an amazing idea. Have you noticed any, is there measurable effects in the vagus nerve? Have you noticed anything, anything there as we start to wrap up?
Yeah, I think the main things we're seeing in terms of the potentially vagal engagement is the high frequency heart rate variability shift that we're seeing from pre-float to during the float, and a lot of the other indicators of parasympathetic tone, like the reduced blood pressure, the reduced muscle tension, the lowered brain waves. So I do think there's going to be at some level vagal involvement. I think a lot of it is going to come down to the fact that floating quite reflexively is shutting off all of your sympathetic arousal and shifting the balance of your nervous system into a parasympathetic state. And the vagal nerve obviously plays a big role in this. And what I think people don't recognize enough is the vagus nerve is remarkably attuned to respiration. And we're lowering respiration when you're floating, like we discussed earlier, just naturally. And when you do it sort of explicitly, when you have that goal, I'm going to regulate my breath, it turns out you're in such a low metabolic state that you could reduce your breathing rate to a minimal level. I remember once saying, all right, I'm going to only breathe one breath a minute. And I went into a float environment and I could do that for 30 minutes. I took 30 breaths in 30 minutes. And if you try to do that, go ahead, try. I dare anybody. Try to do that outside of a float environment. And you're going to be struggling immensely, even after a couple minutes. You're going to need more than just a breath. But in a float environment, you're in the lowest metabolic state that your nervous system may have ever been in. And so it turns out that you can modulate respiration in amazing ways when you're floating.
That's amazing. I'll have to try that, but I mean, I spend a lot of time free diving, so I do a lot of apnea and breath holds, but a 30-second out breath or in breath is that's incredible. Well done. What was that like subjectively? You must have been extremely calm.
You are. I think, one breath is quite slow. That was hard. So I definitely was pushing my limits, but very easily 3, 4, 5 breaths a minute, very easy. And like you said, very calming.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I think you're doing incredible work, and yeah, it's been amazing to speak to you. If somebody wants to support the amazing work you're doing in Maui, or to keep track of what you're doing in future, your future work, where's best to find you? Where's best to support you?
So I think, the main website for the Maui Calm project is going to be mauicalm.org. Our nonprofit also has a website that has a repository of all the peer-reviewed research that we discussed today. And you could find that at clinicalfloat.org. And, I'm not a big social media person, but ever since I moved to Maui, I decided to get on LinkedIn. So you could find me on LinkedIn if you'd like to hear updates about what's happening, some of the research studies that we're going to be conducting, including the Maui Calm project. And even some of my other work. You were just talking about apnea, but my other line of research is breath work and carbon dioxide modulation. So I'll have to come back on at a future time to tell you about some of that. But there's also a whole nother line of interesting research that revolves around being able to teach your nervous system how to cope with carbon dioxide. It's not something that's often discussed, but it turns out it's an extremely powerful tool for modulating, once again, your anxiety levels. So this is work that I also focus on and tend to talk about on LinkedIn when it comes up. So yeah, I'd love for people to check it out. We're going to be opening up this summer in Lahaina proper at the brand new Westside YMCA Resource Center. It's a really beautiful, amazing hub that's being built in Lahaina just to help all the fire survivors. in Lahaina. And it's going to be a beautiful place of healing, and it's all going to be provided to the community completely free of charge. So I'm so excited to study this and see what happens at scale when you let an entire population in need use this service.
I'm extremely excited to track that. And yeah, I really think you're doing incredible work. So please keep it up. It's been a real pleasure to chat to you, Justin. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Josh, for everything you're doing to give a voice to this whole underground world of really novel strategies and tools to keep people's nervous system on the cutting edge. And I think that's really what we're trying to do, is push the evolution of our species in a much better direction than the trials and tribulations of what's happening right now are pushing. I really do think we're at a crossroads moment for our species right now, actually, this generation. And we have to make a choice which way we're going to go. And I'm, quite worried that we're perilously heading towards extinction. But we have this opportunity. We have this opportunity to shift and evolve in a very different way. And these things that we talked about today, and a lot of the other things you're discussing on this podcast, have the chance to advance our species in a much better direction than the one we're currently headed. So thank you for giving a voice to all of this.
Oh, you're most welcome, and we would absolutely love to have you back and talk about the carbon dioxide modulation and more of your work in future. That would be amazing.
Awesome. Well, so good to be here, Josh. Wishing you the best of luck in everything you do.
Thank you so much for listening to the episode. If you enjoyed it, please, if you could give us a like, a subscribe, and hit the notification bell, that would really help us out. Or just share this episode with a friend, share the course with a friend. Anything would go such a long way. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you soon.